like to pick up my phone during the talk and be like, let me get some
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We will begin. After September 11th, the American government sought to go into Muslim communities, build relationships, and win over hearts and minds to counter extremism. Professor Arjun Sethi from Georgetown Law will explain how these programs often devolved into community surveillance programs that track those very hearts and minds they meant to connect with and persuade. A turn that, in his view, has done little to combat genuine terrorism. Please welcome Professor Arjun Sethi.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay? Green lights on. Check. Check. Okay, better. Welcome everyone, very happy to be with you today. So my remarks are going to focus on countering violent extremism programs. These programs seek to identify young Muslim Americans who the government believes are at risk of becoming violent extremists, right? So these are predictive programs. So my remarks today will focus on what these programs are. I'll then provide a broader context, and then I will give you some food for thought about how these programs are ineffective, chill civil rights, and lead to the profiling of Muslim Americans. So again, what are these programs? CVE programs, in some form or shape, began to be rolled out a few years ago and sought to identify, in particular, Muslim American youth who at one point in time in the future could become violent extremists. So these programs have been rolled out in really three different ways. Some years ago, the Obama administration rolled out pilot CVE programs in 3 US cities: Boston, Los Angeles, and Minneapolis. And these programs asked community leaders, so imams, youth coaches, teachers, etc., to again identify Muslim youth who, in their opinion, were exhibiting signs of radicalization, and to then share those names with law enforcement. So again, the idea that somehow there are these indicators that are universal, that are discernible, that community leaders could identify and then provide those names to law enforcement. So those were the pilot programs that were rolled out a few years ago. We then had a program called Don't Be a Puppet. This is a web interface. It's like a game of some kind that the FBI rolled out, again, about 2 years ago, which was intended for teachers to use in school curricula. So again, that they too, based on these certain indicators, could identify Muslim American youth who are at risk of becoming violent extremists. FBI's Don't Be a Puppet website is online. You can check it out. And again, it has these indicators. The third program was a program called Shared Responsibility Committees. And what these programs tried to do was they tried to assemble a team of professionals, right? So again, maybe an imam, maybe a coach, maybe a YMCA official, maybe a government official, certainly somebody from law enforcement, who again would form a committee and intervene to help a Muslim American youth who the government had determined is at risk of becoming a violent extremist. Right? So these are the three programs. That's the landscape of CVE in a nutshell in the last few years. So broader context. I ask you today to think about CVE not in isolation, but think about it really as a form of predictive policing. I don't know how many of you have heard of predictive policing, But predictive policing is based on the idea that we can use big data, right, to predict when a crime will occur or who will commit a crime. So typically, predictive policing is based on either threat scores that are assigned to particular individuals or hot spots. Again, the idea that there will be a certain location, space in a city, for example, the government can look at historical trends, historical data, and devote resources to that area or to individuals based on threat scores, and again, stop a crime before it occurs. And I would suggest to you today that predictive policing has been a miserable failure. They have disproportionately impacted communities of color. They have led to profiling of communities of color. They have little transparency, and perhaps most fundamentally, especially speaking at a law school today, they subvert basic time-tested principles and standards like reasonable suspicion, probable cause. You don't have to be a lawyer to know that we all have the right to go about our business, right? We all have the right to privacy. Predictive policing programs, we have the right to privacy unless, right, there is reasonable suspicion to believe that you have committed a crime, or probable cause to arrest you if, again, there is probable cause to believe that you've committed a crime. So CVE, like predictive policing programs, doesn't rely on time-tested standards like reasonable suspicion or probable cause, right? It tries to intervene very early on in a way that subverts those standards. And secondly, and this is the last thing I'll say about sort of the broader context in which you should understand CVE, is understand that CVE programs are part of a broader architecture of various surveillance programs that the government has rolled out and intensified after 9/11 that profile and disproportionately impact Muslim and Arab Americans. Example, watch lists. Under the US terrorist watch list system, you can be branded a terrorist if either you are a known terrorist or if there is reasonable suspicion to believe that you are a suspected terrorist. Think about how attenuated that is. In fact, the guidance is so broad that the US government can brand you a terrorist on the basis of a single social media post. And that's why Dearborn, Michigan, a city with fewer than 100,000 residents, has more people on the terrorist watch list than any other city in the country except for New York. So watch lists are another example of a program like CVE that disproportionately profile and impact Muslim Americans. Another example of sort of this broader architecture that helps you understand, again, CVE programs. Suspicious activity reporting. So one of the perceived intelligence failures prior to 9/11 was that there was no mechanism for local law enforcement to report what they perceived to be suspicious activity to federal law enforcement. So really what you saw after 9/11 was an intensification of this program called suspicious activity reporting, which is actually not too dissimilar from CVE, but it has important differences. But again, the idea was that local law enforcement should be able to have some type of mechanism to report suspicious activity to law enforcement. The problem is what counts as suspicious activity? According to the federal government, it's pre-terrorism planning. It's pre-intelligence planning. So what does that include? I will tell you. It includes things like Arab and Muslim Americans going to Best Buy and purchasing home computers for their home business. It includes Muslim and Arab Americans taking photos of national monuments. It includes searching for video games online. In one case, it included an Arab American going to Costco and buying pallets of water. All of those examples I just gave you are real cases. All of those individuals performed those activities, which are obviously protected under the Constitution, right? Which we all have the right to do. And yet all of them, in some form or another, were visited by law enforcement
or the intelligence community because that was perceived to be indicia of future terrorist behavior. So with that background, let me tell you a little bit specifically about why these CVE programs don't work. Again, this predictive policing model, as we've seen time and again, doesn't work because it upends basic fundamental standards that we can all agree on, like reasonable suspicion, probable cause. And again, it's part of this broader architecture. Specifically about CVE. First and foremost, the programs are based on junk science. So everyone, shouldn't say everyone because there's always going to be junk scientists out there, but anybody who is of repute, who has actually looked at the phenomena of violent extremism, has found that there are no universal indicators that can predict when an individual or whether an individual will become a violent extremist. You don't have to take my word for it. The British intelligence community some years ago performed an exhaustive study where they interviewed and looked at dozens and dozens of instances of individuals who had embraced violent extremism. And that's exactly what they found, namely that there is no single path to violent extremism. So let me ask you this. If there is no single path to violent extremism, if there are no universal indicators, if it can't be discerned from an outside observer, how do you predict violent extremism? What are the indicators? I will tell you. The government has just made them up. So the indicators the government uses to predict when a Muslim American youth is likely to become a violent extremist include things like, and this is verbatim from government documents and speeches, becoming confrontational at home, a newfound interest in religiosity, using code words, using encrypted applications, traveling to conflict zones overseas, ideological differences, right? These aren't indicators of violent extremism. These are activities that, again, are protected under the First Amendment. These are activities that are protected under basic notions of privacy that I think we can all agree on in the context of civil rights law and human rights law. So in using these flawed indicators, what happens? CVE programs have led to a chilling of basic civil rights in Muslim American and immigrant communities. People are worried that if they express a newfound interest in religiosity, if they grow a beard, if they wear a hijab, if they join an MSA, if they join a Muslim charity, if they attend a protest condemning US drone strikes, if they attend a counter rally to one of the anti-Sharia marches, anti-Sharia marches that took place a few weeks ago, that somehow they will be profiled by law enforcement, right? So these programs have led to a basic chilling of constitutional civil rights and human rights. Basic rights like expression, association, etc. They've also led to profiling. So for me, the case study is and always has been Ahmed Muhammad, right? The young black Muslim boy in Texas who created a homemade clock, and everyone just assumed it was a bomb. So in the age of CVE, Muslim Americans, immigrants, run the risk that any time they express an interest in Islam, any time they show an interest in even things like engineering, right? Express political beliefs, join political associations, they will somehow be construed as a future violent extremist. They will be visited by law enforcement. They will be subject to different kinds of surveillance that you will hear about today as well. I would also add in this context that I'm not alone in denouncing these programs. National teacher associations, health professional associations, psychologists have all come out and said that these programs are based on bad science. In many cases, they don't just lead to profiling of Muslim Americans and immigrant communities, they lead to bullying in our schools. I talked to you a little bit earlier about the Don't Be a Puppet program. How the hell is a teacher supposed to determine whether a student in her class is one day going to become a violent extremist? It's absurd. the last thing I will say specifically about these programs is that they are entirely incommensurate with the threat posed. So, as far as we know right now, no CVE intervention has led to a single sort of a terrorist act prevention. And furthermore, if you look at basic statistics, in the United States, you are far more likely to be harmed or injured by a white supremacist than you are by a Muslim immigrant or refugee. So the fact remains is that these programs are entirely incommensurate with the threat posed, and yet we see time and again that our government routinely wants to ignore threats like white supremacy and double and triple down on these broken intelligence policing hybrid programs that chill constitutional rights, that lead to profiling, and really aren't effective. I think we might have time for 1 minute for questions, or 20 seconds, or 2, 3, 20 seconds. Or maybe we'll just take 2 questions together, and I'll try to answer both together.
We actually do not.
Okay. I've been overruled, my friends. Thank you.